Welcome to Holocaust Museum Houston's virtual programs. Thank you for taking time out and being here this evening. I'm Tamara Savage, Managing Director and Director of Public Programs, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our recorded webcast with guest speaker Christopher Till from South Africa. We are fortunate to have the traveling exhibit Mandela, Struggle for Freedom on view at our museum until January the 3rd, 2021. And if you are in Houston, live in this area, we encourage you to visit our museum and go through this very fine exhibit. Before the introduction of our speaker, I'd like to mention a few things. The chat and Q&A boxes have been disabled as this is a pre-recorded presentation. A recording of the program will be available through our YouTube platform at a later date. We will be sending out the information via email to all registrants within the next day or two. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, Christopher Till, who will address the topic, Nelson Mandela, 1918 to 2013, from prisoner to president. Christopher Till was educated at Hilton College and Rhodes University, where he obtained his master's degree in fine art cum laude. He began his career at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe and then moved on to become director of the Johannesburg Art Gallery, where he was responsible for several groundbreaking exhibitions. From 1991 to 2001, he was director of culture for the city of Johannesburg and has served on numerous boards for museums and theaters, as well as serving on committees and selection panels for art festivals in South Africa and abroad. He also co-curated the South African Pavilion for the 2015 Venice Biennale. Christopher is the founding and current director of the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg and has organized exhibitions on Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko, Oliver Tambo, and the Women's March, among many others. He is the principal driver in the development of the Mandela Capture Site in Howick, KwaZulu-Natal, with its new museum and renowned sculpture of Mr. Mandela by Marco Cianfanelli, as well as the newly opened Javid Art Center at the University of Pretoria. And now I hand over to Christopher.
Well, good evening and welcome to this program, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this program, which I'm delighted to be part of and to give you a little insight into Mandela, the prisoner who became president. As an introduction, I'm going to show you a couple of slides to begin with of the actual institution which gave life to the exhibition, the original exhibition of Nelson Mandela, the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. We've celebrated our 20th year, and in that time we have been able to produce various exhibitions, but one which has captured the imagination of the world, of course, is that of Nelson Mandela. You can see here the approach to the entrance of the museum, and as we go to the next slide and the next, you will see what this building looks like, which is quite an extraordinary architectural statement, which is on a piece of land adjacent to a casino of all things, because it was the casino that gave life to us, in the sense that to get a license for their operation, they had to do something within an area of giving back to the community. That was a spark for an idea to create a museum, and I was asked to be part of that initial thinking and oversaw the development and the building of this museum. Now, the exhibition which you will be seeing in your museum is one which we developed in collaboration with the Holocaust, the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg in Canada. But it was based on what I'm going to show you tonight. Well, it's your midday, isn't it? I'm afraid I'm not sure about timing at this point. So this is the entrance to the Apartheid Museum, where you physically are separated into either a white entrance or a black entrance, which was obviously a symbolic of and at the heart of what apartheid was all about. Now, if we go to the next slide, it shows the first panel of an exhibition which we developed for the 90th year Mandela's 90th birthday in the Apartheid Museum. And what we did was to develop a narrative around a series of headings, and you can see them on the left there: character, comrade, leader, prisoner, negotiator, and statesman. And this first image shows you a photograph of what one could describe as the clash of cultures competing for the centers of power. On the one side is a white magistrate symbolizing Western Christian values and practices, and on the other, a black headman symbolizing a traditional African principle. Both have sticks that emphasize their authority, and Mandela had to develop a synthesis of both these streams of worldviews, as do many South Africans today. So this was his formative juxtaposition of a traditional and a Western concept of authority. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born into circumstances as tenuous as they were modest. He was born in the tiny village of Mvezo, a remote and beautiful part of the Cape Colony. Today, this area is part of the Eastern Cape in the province of South Africa. The Cape Colony was ruled by the British, who had defeated the traditional leaders of the area in a long and bloody war. Mandela has given the name Rolihlahla, which means pulling the branch of a tree, or more colloquially, troublemaker. In many ways, his name mirrors his life, or mirrored his life. Mandela's father, which you can see on the left, Makakanyiswa Mandela, was chief of the village, a man with power and social standing. However, his authority was subject to the authority of the colony. Mandela's mother, Nkosazana Fanny, was the third wife of the chief and a convert to Christianity. From the beginning, Mandela's life would be shaped by the opposing forces of modernity and tradition, of the ancestors and the state. His ancestral roots were deeply embedded in the Tembu people and the Madiba clan. Nkosazana Fanny converted to Christianity and had her son baptized as a Methodist. Here we begin to see Mandela begin a journey where he engaged with both the traditional values of his father and the Western values bestowed upon him by the church and a Western education. Mandela's mother, Nkosazana Fanny, was the third wife of Rolihlahla Henry Mandela. Circumstance forced Mandela to move first to Qunu, and then after the death of his father, to Mkwekezeni, the Great Place, where he became the ward of the Tembu regent and a powerful leader in the area, and managed the transition from traditional life to becoming part of the colonial machinery. Mandela has spoken about his rural background, which had a profound influence on his life. Here he was steeped in Xhosa culture and traditions. He believed in his experience of growing up, working and playing with groups of people, taught him the values of collective effort. This was strongly reinforced when he underwent his initiation ceremony together with his friend Justice and other boys from the area. They were circumcised together when they were 16, and after the initiation ceremony, Chief Mbekeki spoke to the young men. Here sit our sons, young, healthy, and handsome, the flower of Xhosa tribe, the pride of our nation. We have just circumcised them in a ritual that promised manhood, a promise that can never be fulfilled, for we Xhosas are all black South Africans and are conquered people. Now, at first, Mandela felt that the chief was wrong to cast such a dark shadow on these festive celebrations, but later he would fight to achieve justice for these conquered people. Having excelled at school, Mandela became one of the few black men of his generation to attend the University of Fort Hare, which I think is showed in the next slide. Now, that image there is the Great Place where he just go back please, Sam, where he sat at the feet of the regent and learned about Xhosa tradition. He learned about negotiation. He learned about community involvement and dialogue, which was very much a formative part of his character thereafter. If we go to the next slide. This is where he received a a Western tradition. The previous slide was the school that he attended, and then he went on to university, the University of Fort Hare. Now, this was a college for black men who attended by the elite of Southern Africa. There was no doubt that Mandela's education was of undeniable British character, and he developed a taste for all things British. However, Clarksbury to Healdtown, which were the schools that he attended, both missionary schools, to Fort Hare, Mandela was increasingly exposed to a wider world that was removed from the tradition of his youth. The people that he met exposed him to a wider political milieu where his own political awareness of injustice began to develop. The friendship that he developed with Oliver Tambo at Fort Hare was to last a lifetime, with both working together in a battle against the apartheid regime. When Mandela was expelled from Fort Hare, the regent, John Jinkwat Taba, was furious and decided that both Mandela and Justice, his son, would enter into arranged marriages. The young man was horrified at this and decided to run away to the far-off city of Johannesburg, where they both got jobs as security guards on a mine. At a stroke, Mandela had abandoned his prospects of becoming a powerful local leader and had destroyed his future, or so it seemed, but Johannesburg was to offer a different destiny. Mandela's move to Johannesburg changed the course of his life and career. He acknowledged this when if I had stayed at home, I would have been a respected chief today. I would have had a big stomach, and a lot of cattle and sheep. Now, these two images show Mandela as a boxer because he loved boxing. And what a figure of a man, as you can see on the left-hand side in boxing kit, and on the right where he's sparring on the roof of some building in the middle of Johannesburg. The meeting of Mandela and Muhammad Ali at a particular moment was really seen by him as something of a highlight and a nod to his own aspirations as a warrior, but as a boxer as well. Can we move on, please, Samantha? When he reached Johannesburg in the 1940s, it was a cosmopolitan place. Blacks were restricted to living in certain parts of the city as the authorities tried to balance their need for migrant labor and their desire for white domination. In black townships, an urban culture had grown quickly, and this included a new cultural expression and a vibrant nightlife. It also included a growing political culture led predominantly by the African National Congress, the ANC, a black nationalist organization started in 1912 in opposition to colonial legislation, which removed land ownership from the black majority. Township life was also precarious. There was no electricity, limited water supply, housing was scarce and overcrowded. Mandela found himself in Alexander Township in Johannesburg, which is one of the few areas of South Africa where Africans would acquire freehold property. Although Mandela was living in poverty in a single room, he was confined with loneliness and frustration, and he became to regard Alexandra as the dark city. Now, the image that you see here was during the 1952 Defiance campaign, which was at center stage and flanked by two of his comrades, Dr. Yusuf Dadoo, president of the South African Indian Congress and senior member of the South African Communist Party, and Dr. James Moroka, leader of the African National Congress. He had clearly embraced non-racialism. How did a young man from Mvezo find himself at the center of political activity in 1952? Let's move on, please. During his sojourn at Wits University, where he enrolled to complete his law degree, he met a number of members of the Communist Party. Although not attracted to communism, Mandela enjoyed attending their meetings. It was his first experience of meeting whites who were totally divested of color consciousness. When Mandela joined Lembede, Sisulu, and Tambo in the forming of the Youth League, and the image here you see is of Oliver Tambo, this was the start of his lifelong struggle against the injustice of apartheid. Mandela was influenced by a number of political events in the 1940s. Among these was a strike of 60,000 black mine workers in 1946, and the passive resistance campaign of South African Indians in the same year. These events demonstrated the power of mass resistance. In 1948, a whites-only election brought the National Party to power, along with its policy of apartheid, the separation of the races in all aspects of life, and the intensification of white domination. The stage was set for a showdown between an increasingly powerful and aggressive form of white rule and the rising political consciousness of the urban blacks and their allies. It was the ANC Youth League that responded to the state's tightening grip, calling for a program of action based on non-violent confrontation. From this point on, Mandela became immersed in the politics of the ANC. The ANC became his family, with his own family taking a back seat. This is underscored in an interview in 2000 with the US TV host Larry King, asking him, "What happened to your ego?" To which Mandela replied, "My ego is shared by all men and women of the ANC. It does not belong to any one individual." During the 1950s, Mandela was leading the ANC in decisive campaigns against the apartheid regime, but he was to pay a heavy price for this. He was slapped with a myriad of banning orders, ranging from a few months to 5 years in 1956. This prevented him from attending any gatherings, political or otherwise. He was also not allowed to be in the company of more than one person at a time. His political involvement placed a strain on his marriage to Evelyn Massey, and they eventually divorced, and he subsequently married Winnie Mandela. And with the rise of the apartheid, the Mine Workers Union, as you can see, organized this mass action. However, the strike was crushed with 12 miners killed in the oppressive nature of what was to follow for so many years. The next theme, prefaced by this picture, which somehow cuts to the core of how Black people in South Africa were viewed by a white minority. Here we have a road sign, "Caution, beware of natives," which was underlined the segregation and the brutality of the rigid system of apartheid. Next slide, please. This is an image of Mandela's house in Soweto, where he and his previous wife and ultimately Winnie lived for a period of time. It's a very modest home in Soweto, the township just outside of Johannesburg, which has been turned into a museum, which is operated also by the Apartheid Museum. Next slide, please. We then look to the third theme, leader, and the image of this theme shows Mandela, who was operating underground at the time, making a surprise appearance at the All in Africa conference in March 1961. At this conference, he called for a national convention to plot a new path for South Africa. Mandela, now president of the Transvaal, one of the 4 provinces of the then Union of South Africa, is every inch a leader, as one can see, towering above his comrades, commanding respect, bridging the more conservative old guard and more militant young guard. In the early 1950s, Black resistance to apartheid began to gather momentum, and Mandela found himself at the center of a rising tide of protest. In May 1952, Mandela joined the organizing committee of the Defiance Campaign, a campaign of non-violent mass resistance to apartheid laws, organized by the ANC and its allies. Tens of thousands of people were drawn into the activities, which involved deliberately defying unjust laws and suffering the consequences. Mandela was appointed volunteer-in-chief, and he traveled to the country urging people to break unjust laws en masse to court arrest. Together with his comrades, he devised a system to set up committees, street by street, allowing people to be mobilized quickly to respond to the calls for resistance. It was called the M Plan. He was already a leader and seen as a leader in the ANC, and he took to the position comfortably. At a meeting in Port Elizabeth in 1952, as you can see in the slide here, "One day I will be the first Black president of South Africa." Due to the banning order, Mandela was unable to attend the Congress of the People in 1955, where the Freedom Charter was presented. He was forced to watch the proceedings from a distance over a fence. This important document, based on the demands of the ordinary people, collected by notes that were collected from the people of South Africa, sets out a vision for a South African as a democratic state in which all races would be equal and in all which the wealth of the country would be shared. On reviewing the charter, Mandela was moved by the response of the people. It was humbling to see how the suggestion of ordinary people were often far ahead of those of the leaders. The government deemed the Freedom Charter to be a communist document which called for the overthrow of the state. As a result, 156 people, including Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, were arrested under the Suppression of Communism Act in 1956 and charged with treason. After a prolonged trial lasting nearly 5 years, the accused were found guilty. In 1960 was an epic year of South African history. The Pan-African Congress, the PAC, a rival organization of the ANC, organized a series of mass protests against the government, requiring that all people carry a pass, a government document giving them limited permission to spend time in urban areas. Without a pass or in contravention of their pass conditions, was automatically jailed. At a protest in Sharpeville, and this is an important event, south of Johannesburg in March 1960, the police opened fire on an unarmed crowd, killing at least 69 people, many of whom were shot in the back. A major crackdown followed within weeks, and the ANC and the PAC were banned, and the mass arrests took place throughout the country. The Sharpeville Massacre was a turning point in the struggle against apartheid. Both the ANC and the PAC went into exile, and in June 1961, Mandela himself was briefly arrested and then went underground, living a life of a fugitive, adopting different disguises and moving from one safe house to another. While he was underground, Mandela gave a secret interview to an ITV television interview where he mooted for the first time the possibility of armed struggle. You can see the idea came to the fruition when Mkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation, the ANC's military wing, was also known as MK, was formed on the 16th of December 1961, and Mandela appointed commander-in-chief for a time. The timing was awkward, for just 6 days before, Chief Albert Luthuli, president of the ANC, had received the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway. In January 1962, Mandela left the country illegally and visited several countries in Africa seeking finance, military training, and weapons. He made contact with the liberation movements all over the continent and learned a great deal about guerrilla warfare. In Morocco, he met the Algerian liberation movement in exile. He then went on to London to meet Oliver Tambo and to convince him of the need to adopt an armed struggle. He learned much about strategy, tactics, and revolution on this trip, which he took back to the comrades inside South Africa. The MK cadres must be taught that the revolution was not just a question of pulling a trigger and firing. It was an organization that was intended to take over political power. That is what we stressed, quote from Nelson Mandela. Then, on his return to South Africa, he was arrested on the 5th of August 1962, which the previous slide on the newspaper showed. The rest of MK High Command was arrested at Lily Leaf's farm in the Ravonia, just outside of Johannesburg, the following year. They were all charged with sabotage, and which carried the death sentence in what became known as the Ravonia Trial. In Britain, the anti-apartheid movement and the International Defence Aid, IDAF, set up an international campaign for the release of the Ravonia trialists against the imposition of the death penalty. So here one sees in the main image Albert Luthuli receiving the Nobel Peace Prize that I spoke of, and in the middle you'll see a bearded Nelson Mandela as the Black Pimpernel who was hiding from the police. Now there's often a misconception that Mandela was arrested at Ravonia, where his comrades were arrested and the treason trial followed, but that was not the case. He was arrested, as I've said, on the way back from meeting with Albert Luthuli to report to him about his trip into Africa, in sensitizing people to the ANC and the struggle that was going on in South Africa. You can, and you know, the Ravonia trial was of the individuals that you can see to the right of the screen in mug shots, which they were. But Mandela was not part of that trial because he was not arrested at Ravonia. However, he became part of that trial when documents were found at Lily's farm implicating Mandela in what was considered by the South African government as a plot to overthrow the government. Here are some images on the steps of the court with Winnie Mandela in her hat and bag, supporting Mandela right through the trial, which was one of the most momentous, obviously, in our country's history. The following image, please. This is Ravonia, the house, and as I've tried to indicate, this is where the high command of the ANC was meeting to plot and plan a strategy to overthrow the apartheid state. The next image of the house, which is now a museum, shows you it as a museum in the foreground of this picture, with various other buildings in the background, in which Mandela stayed for a particular moment, posing as a gardener. But the meeting of the high command in this building was surprised, and they were all arrested. And as I've just indicated, Mandela was not arrested there, but he was arrested on the road back from Durban to Johannesburg after having traveled to Durban to meet with Albert Luthuli, the leader of the ANC, who, as I've indicated, just won the prize, and to say, my leader, I'm now advocating that we turn to armed struggle. So it was a very difficult moment for Chief Albert Luthuli. These are actual pictures of the Ravonia house and what it looked like at the time of the arrest. Then the next theme I'm going to speak to, and I'm just watching the time to make sure that I'm within time, is the theme prisoner. Now, this image on the introductory panel was found in the National Archives, labeled "A Prisoner in the Garden." However, Mandela was not simply a prisoner, but the most famous political prisoner in the world. He's angry in this photograph. His body language is defiant, making a mockery of the spade on which he leans. The garden is a barren area full of stones. Now, as a prisoner, he was a leader in the sense that he motivated his fellow prisoners, and he defied the authority which was subjugated him to the humility of jail and everything that went with that. And here he is leaning on his spade with a pair of sunglasses, which was as a result of them having to work in a limestone quarry, which damaged his sight. And in fact, it was Helen Suzman, who was a regular visitor to the Robben Island, and as the only female and Progressive Party candidate at that stage in Parliament, advocating for the improved conditions of the prisoners within Robben Island, and she was responsible for getting him those sunglasses. So Mandela and his comrades endured harsh and isolated circumstances on Robben Island. Their suffering was as long as it was intense. Robben Island, a small barren island off the coast of Cape, offered them a tantalizing view of the city without any prospect of escape. The prisoners, the elite of African society, were kept in isolation cells, separated from each other except during exercise periods. They were made to labor daily on the lime quarry, to suffer intense cold, eat minimal quantities of terrible food, and for the first 9 years they had no access to water, to hot water, just a bucket for a toilet. A harsh code of punishment hung over them at all times. During his incarceration, Mandela penned many letters to loved ones, compatriots, prison authorities, and government officials. Initially, he was only allowed to write and receive one letter of 500 words every 6 months. These letters would often be censored, many of which would never reach their intended destination. The letter album has a selection of correspondence to loved ones from the period of 1969 to 71. And you can see here a picture. The main picture shows the booth through which the one visitor every 6 months could sit and look through the glass at the prisoner beyond. And the images that you can see in the middle is Winnie Mandela, his wife, who was banished to Brontville, a small town in the remote area of South Africa. And on the right-hand side, it shows you Mandela with his son, who was killed in a car accident, and he was not able to go to the funeral. So the deprivation of his freedom was not only a physical deprivation, but it was very much a mental assault by the apartheid state. To put pressure on the apartheid regime in the 60s, a boycott movement in Britain launched an international boycott of apartheid goods. An apartheid struggle escalated inside of South Africa. The boycott movement grew into a global campaign for total isolation of the country. This included sport, cultural and consumer boycott, and arms embargo and economic sanctions. In the early 70s, a new wave of resistance of apartheid met with brutal repression. Thousands were detained, tortured. The Mkhonto Wesizwe recruits were sentenced to death. In Britain, the anti-apartheid movement and the International Defence Aid Fund campaigned for the release of political prisoners, and a general awareness of Nelson Mandela was generated internationally. And this is an image of the Wembley Stadium concert to set Mandela free on his 70th birthday tribute, which is the most extraordinary event, with thousands of people attending to acknowledge Mandela and to celebrate his life and demand his freedom. So in the 1970s, a younger generation began to stir. In 76, the children of Soweto led the way with a massive protest against the government and education for Africans, which were conducted in Afrikaans language. They protested against this. When police opened fire on the protest, it turned into an uprising spreading quickly from Soweto throughout the country. And in the ensuing weeks, 1,000 people were killed by police. Then the next slide shows you the moment which everybody had been waiting for. After 27 years of internment, and Mandela went to firstly Pollsmoor prison in Cape Town after the Robben Island incarceration, and then he went on to the Victor Verster prison, which was a smaller prison where he'd been, in inverted commas, beginning to be reintegrated into a contemporary life. And here is the moment where Nelson Mandela and Winnie emerged from the gates of the Victor Verster prison, hands and fists raised in the salute, where the entire world had been waiting to see him emerge from this halfway house and into final freedom, which, by the way, he had refused to accept unless it was unconditional and that his comrades had been released before him. It is worth remembering that at the time it was a crime in South Africa to display a photograph of Mandela or to quote him. So after decades of isolation, this moment of seeing what he actually looked like was the most extraordinary experience for all of us here in South Africa. Move on, please. This image shows you the moment some hours later after that release, where Mandela had been bundled into a car. And remember that this was the liberation movement of the ANC had been banned for many, many years. And they had to try and navigate through crowds of people, through back streets, to get Mandela to Cape Town City Hall, where he finally appeared on a balcony and gave his first address. And on the right of him is Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now our current president. And on the left, in the glasses, is Walter Sisulu, his comrade of so many years ago. And what an extraordinary moment of this image addressing thousands of people on the balcony of the City Hall overlooking the Grand Parade on his release on the 11th of February 1990. It was his first speech in 27 years. How did Mandela get to be a free man addressing the people of Cape Town, South Africa, and the world? what a most amazing anticipated moment to broadcast. Then in the 1980s, South Africa was a period of major upheaval. The young lions, the youth, had heeded the call of Oliver Tambo, leader of the ANC in exile, to make townships ungovernable, campaigned by the United Democratic Front, UDF, an umbrella movement within the country of civic, church, student workers and other organizations opposed to apartheid, and COSATU, the Congress of South African Unions, launched in 1985, pushed the apartheid regime to rethink their position. At the time, a huge international movement was built up, demanding the release of Mandela and other political prisoners and an end to apartheid. The ANC, under the leadership of Oliver Tambo, had mobilized communities and governments all over the world. Millions of ordinary people, including in the UK, applied pressure, which eventually resulted in the isolation of South African state. So in 1985, the Apartheid Museum was under siege, faced with increasing resistance and repeated calls for the recent release of Mandela. The then President P.W. Botha offered to free Mandela on conditions that he renounced violence. Mandela's release, a statement which was delivered by his daughter Zinzi to a packed stadium in Soweto, were these famous words: "I cherish my freedom, but I care even more for your freedom. I cannot and will not give any an undertaking at a time when you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated. I will return." And here he is, having returned, having been released, and having gone through all of those years in isolation. He was now leading the negotiation with the apartheid state to find a way to reach a democratic election. And this is an image of what was known as CODESA, which was the discussions between the ruling party and the ANC, and now released, in trying to find a negotiated settlement, if one can describe it, in reaching the point where we could go to an election. The jubilation of Mandela's release was enormous, but the struggle was not over, of course. Mandela asked the international community to maintain boycott and sanctions until there was an agreement on a new constitution, which guaranteed one person, one vote in a unitary South Africa. And so negotiations that you see taking place here between the ANC and the government was against the backdrop of intense violence. This verged on a civil war between the Inkatha, a Zulu nationalist group, and the ANC in a struggle for dominance. This conflict took on an ethnic dimension between Zulu and Xhosa-speaking South Africans, who comprised the majority of the ANC supporters. Members of Inkatha were largely Zulu migrant workers who lived in the workers' hospitals in the industrial areas in many black townships. Brutal attacks occurred in the period of 1990 to 1904, and it was the bloodiest in the South African history. Isn't that ironic? On his release, those 4 years of intense negotiation were terrible moments of a sort of a low-key civil war. The ANC charged the National Party with fanning the flames of violence through a third force, and a group of security operatives that colluded with Inkatha were operated covertly to weaken the ANC. President de Klerk referred to these attacks as black-on-black violence and argued that black South Africans were incapable of governing themselves. Let's move to the next one. And here, after all of this violence, the assassination of the South African Communist Party, Chris Hani, which nearly led to a total bloodbath in this country. And Mandela was the only person who could be seen to contain the situation. De Klerk asked him to address the nation. And of course, remember that he wasn't president at this time, on television, and appealed for an end to the violence from the moment on Mandela was a de facto president of the country. And then here it shows you Mandela and de Klerk shaking hands. They found one another. They came together and understood one another. And there's the famous moment where Mandela said to de Klerk, he had studied the history of the Afrikaner. He had studied their struggle. He understood their struggle. And he had been a freedom fighter for his own people, so he understood that. It's not to say that there weren't schisms and and arguments between them, but finally we reached the point of the election. Can we move on, please? I would imagine I've only got about 5 more minutes. This is just the first car that was built for him at the Mercedes factory by the Metal Workers Union, with parts donated by Mercedes-Benz, and which he used for his transport for a period. And this is a view inside the exhibition at the Apartheid Museum. The next slide. Let's move on rather quickly now, please. There we are. The election took place, and there was the inauguration of the first Black president of South Africa, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, with his daughter at his side. Next picture. There he is sworn in by the Chief Justice. And the next picture, if I'm not mistaken, shows the fly past over the Union buildings in salute of our first president. Next slide. There were critical challenges that Mandela had to face. There was the AIDS pandemic. There was huge issues which, from a new president's point of view, trying to hold the country together, were really challenges which he managed with great aplomb. He was an extraordinary negotiator and a huge international figure on the world stage. He was the first to acknowledge his own, he tended to be autocratic in a certain sense, but he left a lot to his lieutenants to carry on the work. And the scourge of HIV/AIDS, which was a huge thing within the time of his presidency, was something which he acknowledged by saying that one of his own children had died of that dreaded disease. So amazing leader, using his huge charisma to take South Africa into the world stage and to bring South Africa back into the family of the international community. Let's move on, please. The final moment is him as statesman, as I've described. The way that he conducted himself. This shows him in a rugby jersey. Rugby in South Africa is a huge sport and was seen to be very much a white sport. It was the final of the World Cup. Mandela came onto the stage, onto the field, wearing a rugby jersey. And I think the next picture shows him there with the cap and the jersey with the captain of our rugby team who won that World Cup in that year, which was an extraordinary moment of bringing South Africans together. And of course, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was presided over by Bishop Desmond Tutu, and the document being handed to him in the picture on the right of the documents that came out of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where if you acknowledged your crimes, you could be given amnesty, which many were. The actual Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a whole subject on its own, which I won't go into now. Next, please. So there we are, just to show him as the international statesman. The picture on the left is him at the United Nations. It shows him with world leaders from all over the world. There is a sculpture of Nelson Mandela in London. And he really has grasped the imagination of the international community as a figure who crosses all boundaries and projects not only a fighter for freedom, but also as a reconciliator in coming out of 27 years of jail and saying we need to build a new nation, we need to hold hands, and everybody has a place in our country. Next slide. I'm not sure what's left here. And I just flick through these, please, Samantha. These are just an image of, as you come through the Apartheid Museum, you can select one of those colored sticks which represent a saying of Mandela. here he is with the late Johnny Clegg and Savuka, the band, and just showing him in his Madiba shirt and how he was just such an approachable human being. Next slide, please. Oh, this is an image of this exhibition in its form that I've shown you. Has traveled around the world. We've shown it in many countries in various forms. This is just a picture of the opening at the South Bank in London a couple of years ago with Harry and his wife, and just to show how this exhibition has moved to many places. The next. And then lastly, just to quickly show you, this is the Nelson Mandela capture site where he was arrested. I have built a new museum there, which opened in February. There's an extraordinary sculpture that we've put up, which I think might be the next slide, which shows Nelson Mandela coming into focus, his face coming into focus as you walk down this pathway and you reach these poles. There are 50 of those poles stretched out over 30 meters by about 10 meters. And at a particular moment, he comes into focus. And as you move through those poles, it dissipates, of course. So the spirit of Mandela was there. He disappears and he reappears. And it's really just another a moment of showing what an iconic figure Nelson Mandela really is. Next, please. Finally, a wonderful image of him standing in the landscape of the Cape, not far from the final prison that he was released, looking over the landscape in an extraordinarily human picture of a man of such power and such grace. And we are so privileged as South Africans to have him as our president for those years. And I was so privileged to drive him around in the golf cart into the exhibition that I've just shown you, or parts of it, and say, Mr. President, this is your life. And the most extraordinary thing is he kept on pointing out everybody else, never referring to himself, was not really interested in him, in himself or what we were showing about him. He wanted to comment on all those people around him, and that is really at the core of what a great humanitarian Mandela was, and what a character he is for the world. Now, in finishing off, the exhibition that you will be seeing is based on this exhibition. It's not this exhibition. It's a newly curated exhibition together with, as I said at the beginning of this little talk, with the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, who've done a wonderful job in taking what we have done and presenting it into an extraordinary exhibition, which you will all be privileged to be able to view. I think that is it. I've run over my time, I'm sure. I apologize for that, but I hope you find this vaguely interesting.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was really very illuminating. If anybody has any questions, I don't see any in the Q&A box, but in the meantime, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the Mandela capture site at Howick, and you know, how it came to be made into a museum.
Well, yes, I happen to live in KZN, although I commute to Johannesburg to the Apartheid Museum. And on the side of the road, there was a little plaque which said, oh, this is where Nelson Mandela was arrested. And I felt, well, we could certainly do something better than this. Took a left turn and went into the little, the Howick municipality, found somebody in his office and said, this is who I am, this is what I do. I live in the area. And 11 years later, after having persuaded the powers that be to buy the property across the road from that little plaque, we've progressively built that site into the most extraordinary space, where the landscape is considered, the building designed by Jeremy Rose of Mashobani Rose, a colleague of mine who sadly passed away recently. The experience in that is really the history of the apartheid story in KZN, with the footsteps of Mandela walking through it. And then, of course, there's that extraordinary sculpture where you walk down that pathway, the long walk to freedom, and you see this moment where where Mandela emerges again, where he disappeared for 27 years and he comes back again. So it's become an internationally acknowledged place to go. The sculpture has become known all over the world, which I'm very pleased about. But again, it's just revealing the power of the name of Nelson Mandela. But it's not just the name, of course, it is what he stood for, and what we should, as those working with a new generation who know nothing about the apartheid past, really, who know very little about Mandela, other than this kind of Che Guevara type kind of figure in the distance, and for us to introduce them to the principles of what Nelson Mandela stood for, and how enormously powerful those principles were in transforming a state which was about to collapse into a total civil war, into one which we're now hopefully having to rebuild, I have to say, rebuild.
So I do have another question for you. It says, can you tell us a little about Winnie Mandela?
Yes, Winnie Mandela is an extraordinarily powerful figure, a controversial figure, a person who was subjected to the most appalling abuse as the second wife of Nelson Mandela, a very beautiful, as you could see, woman with a very powerful demeanor, in saying that this country would be ultimately ruled by a black president, and that president would be Nelson Mandela. She was, as I indicated in one of those panels, confined to her home in Brandfort, which is in the and banned, and she fought very hard to maintain the presence of Mandela in South Africa against a hugely powerful state. She is controversial in the sense that she was involved at a particular moment with a group of young men who were known as the Mandela football team. And by that stage, she had become divorced from Nelson Mandela, very sadly. But she was seen as Mama Winnie, and is still seen as Mama Winnie by many, many people in this country. But she is seen in some quarters as having fallen short, finally, of continuing her extraordinary struggle. But that is a big subject which one needs to unpack and look at it from all angles. But you cannot take away from the fact that she was a fighter, she was a freedom fighter, and she had
a very prominent role.
And a prominent role, yes.
So all of his remaining children, I know that some of his children aren't alive, but one of the questions is, of his remaining children, are any of them following in their dad's shoes, you know, following his cause, continuing his cause?
Well, certainly Zinzi Mandela, the young daughter who in the stadium uttered the words that I read earlier on, that you know, he would not be free until everybody was free, went on to become an ambassador for South Africa. At one stage, I think she was in Argentina, and then I'm not sure, I think it was Italy. She very sadly passed away recently. So she did play a diplomatic role at a particular moment. And his grandson, Mandla, has inherited, if that's the right word, the chieftainship of the Mandela clan down in the Eastern Cape, and very close to where Mandela is buried at Qunu. He is at Mvezo, which was the birthplace of Mandela, where he now lives, and he has a visitor center there, which is obviously honoring his grandfather.
So it's not really, one of the attendees had mentioned that they had visited the Apartheid Museum last year and found it to be exceptional, and wondered if there was a negative impact on funding due to COVID.
Very, very much so. I mean, we are dependent on the take at the door and the sale of things in the shop. And we've had to close the museum in mid-March, and we've had no income from March and to date. We had
Is it open now?
No, we had a reserve which we've chewed through rapidly, and we are trying to look at opening the museum again next month. But it's a balance between how much money that costs for us to reopen and how much we can actually recoup at the door, where are we only losing more money than we are at the moment. So we are very, very much in a situation of needing support for us to get back to a moment where we can again invite visitors and international visitors, as well as our local visitors, to visit the Apartheid Museum and bring us back to a financial stability again. So sadly, we are not open until November, maybe, but it all depends if we are able to generate some funding. A terribly difficult thing for us to even consider, thinking of how the Apartheid Museum has become an internationally known organization, and how we were the best visited museum in South Africa, other than possibly Robben Island, but that was also the sort of boat trip across Table Bay. So yeah, we certainly do need support.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for such an engaging talk, and you certainly, gave us a lot of background on Mandela, and I know a lot of Americans were fascinated by that. So thank you very much. I want to be considerate of everyone's time, so I'm going to close this out. And thank you for joining us on this webcast, everyone. And I'm going to say tot ziens, which is goodbye in Afrikaans.
And cheers.
Cheers.